My younger brother took the house our father built with his own hands, the RRSP I spent 30 years building, and the small welding business I ran for 2 decades, all of it, gone in a single afternoon in a lawyer's office in Sudbury. He did it with a pen, a forged signature, and a financial advisor who smiled too much. I was 63 years old, standing in the parking lot of that office in February, in -22, without a coat because I'd left it inside and I couldn't make myself go back in. I just stood there. Snow was blowing sideways off the roof. My truck, my name was still on the registration, for what it was worth, sat 20 feet away. I couldn't move. You need to understand what I had before you can understand what losing it felt like. My name is Thomas. I grew up in a 3-bedroom house on Regent Street in Sudbury, Ontario, the oldest of 2 boys. My father, a man who never raised his voice, but never had to, worked the nickel mines for 31 years. He came home every evening smelling of sulfur and rock dust, ate whatever my mother put in front of him, and on weekends he built things. He built our back deck. He built the garden shed, and in 1987, when the company offered early retirement packages, he used his buyout to purchase a small commercial property on the edge of town, a garage with a loading dock and 3 bay doors. And he told me, "Tommy, one day this is yours. Don't waste it." I didn't waste it. I spent 2 years apprenticing as a welder after high school, earned my Red Seal certification, and by the time I was 27, I was running that shop with 4 employees. By the time I turned 50, we had 11. We did structural fabrication, pipeline repair, industrial maintenance contracts with the mining sector. Nothing glamorous, nothing that made the papers. But it was real, and it was ours. My father died in 2009. My mother followed 3 years later. They left the property, and whatever remained in savings split equally between myself and my younger brother, Philip. Philip is 8 years younger than me. Growing up, I used to carry him on my shoulders at the Sudbury Wolves games. I taught him to skate on Ramsey Lake. When he got his first apartment after college, I drove the moving truck. When his first marriage fell apart in his late 30s, he spent 4 months sleeping on my couch, and I never once made him feel like a burden. That's who I thought he was. My brother, the person who knew me better than anyone. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't find out until much later, was that somewhere around 2017, Philip started seeing a financial advisor named Terrence. Not the kind you find through a credit union or a bank branch, the private kind, the kind who drives a German car and suggests dinner instead of a boardroom. Terrence specialized, as far as I can tell, in finding families where one member held most of the assets, and another member was envious enough to do something about it. He was patient. He was methodical, and he had Philip's ear for 3 years before any of this started. It began with small things. Philip started asking questions about the business. Curious questions at first. How's the cash flow? Are you thinking about retirement? What happens to the property if something happens to you? I thought it was just the kind of thing people start thinking about when they get into their 50s. I gave him honest answers because he was my brother, and I had nothing to hide. Then came the document. In early 2020, Philip brought me something he said was a partnership restructuring agreement that Terrence had prepared. He said it was for tax efficiency, that it would protect both of us if anything ever happened, that it was standard for family-owned businesses. It was 43 pages, single-spaced, full of language I didn't understand. He sat across from me at my kitchen table and explained it in a way that sounded reasonable, and I asked if I should have my own lawyer look at it, and he said, "Tom, it's just paperwork. Terrence does this all the time. Don't make it weird." I signed it. I want to tell you I had a bad feeling. I want to tell you something in my gut said, "Stop." But the truth is, I trusted him. I had trusted him my entire life. It didn't occur to me that the person I'd carried on my shoulders at hockey games was sitting across from me reading from a script someone else had written. What I signed, as I would eventually learn, was not a restructuring agreement. It was a phased transfer of controlling interest in the business and the property. Terrence had drafted it to look routine, buried the critical clauses in language that would take a corporate lawyer 3 hours to untangle, and Philip had presented it at a moment when I was tired and distracted. My wife had just been diagnosed with early-stage rheumatoid arthritis. The shop had lost a major contract, and I was not thinking clearly. Nothing happened immediately. That was the clever part. Philip didn't suddenly show up and change the locks. The documents sat there, registered and legal, while life continued as normal. Another year passed. Then another. In January 2022, I got a letter from a law firm in Toronto I'd never heard of, informing me that, pursuant to the partnership agreement signed in February 2020, my brother was exercising his right to assume full operational and financial control of the business, effective in 30 days. Attached was a valuation of the property prepared by an appraiser I'd never met, which valued it at roughly 60% of what I knew it was worth. Also attached was a check for that amount, less administrative fees, which amounted to Terrence's commission. I sat at my kitchen table and read that letter 4 times. Then I called Philip. He picked up on the second ring, which told me he'd been waiting. "Tom," he said before I could speak, "I know why you're calling. Terrence told me you'd get the letter today. I think it's best if we let the lawyers handle it from here." And he hung up. I drove to his house that afternoon. I rang the doorbell. His wife answered, looked at me with an expression I can only describe as rehearsed sympathy, and told me Philip wasn't available and that I should contact his legal representation. She closed the door slowly, deliberately, like she wanted me to see it close. The following months were the worst of my life. My own lawyer, a good man, semi-retired, who had handled my father's estate, reviewed the documents and went quiet in a way that told me everything before he said a word. "Thomas," he said, "whoever drafted this knew exactly what they were doing. This is going to be a difficult fight." It was. The legal costs alone nearly finished me before the fight did. I spent 14 months and over $110,000 in legal fees trying to challenge a document that had my signature on every relevant page. Philip's legal team, 3 lawyers from that Toronto firm, all under 50, all very comfortable, argued that the agreement was signed freely and with full understanding. My shop, the one my father bought so I would have something, was transferred to Philip's name in the spring of 2023. The property went with it. My RRSP, which had been used as collateral in one of the clauses I hadn't understood, was liquidated to cover a loan balance I had apparently acknowledged in the same document. I walked away with enough to cover 8 months of rent and not much more. I was 64 years old. I had 11 employees I had to let go. I had a wife with a chronic illness whose medications were not fully covered. And I had a brother who had not spoken to me since the phone call where he told me to contact his lawyers. I moved us into a 2-bedroom apartment in the east end of Sudbury. My wife. God, she never once made me feel ashamed of it. She unpacked our boxes and she made that apartment feel like somewhere we lived rather than somewhere we'd landed. But I knew. Every morning, I woke up in that place, I knew it had been taken. I stopped calling people. Not intentionally, but one by one the conversations became harder to start. Men I'd known for 20 years. People I'd done business with. Friends from the shop floor. They were uncomfortable around failure. Not cruel. Just uncertain. I understood. It didn't make the quiet easier. There were nights that winter when I sat by the window after my wife had gone to sleep, and I did not feel like a man with a future. I'm telling you that plainly. I'm not ashamed of it now, when you've worked 40 years for something and watched it disappear into a document you didn't understand. There are nights when the arithmetic of continuing doesn't feel worth doing. But every morning my wife made coffee. And that, for a long time, was enough. I'm not sure exactly what shifted in March of 2024. My wife had a good week. Her medication had been adjusted and she was sleeping better. And on a Saturday morning, she asked me to go through the storage unit we'd rented to hold what didn't fit in the apartment. She wanted her grandmother's china. Said she was tired of using the everyday plates. I spent 3 hours in that storage unit. Cold, poorly lit, smelling of cardboard and motor oil from an old fishing outboard I kept meaning to sell. I went through boxes I hadn't opened since the move. Old tax returns, my Red Seal certification framed and wrapped in newspaper, a coffee tin full of bolts I'd saved from the original shop equipment because my father had bought them. And then I found the accordion folder. My mother kept one for every important document in her life. They were organized and labeled in her handwriting, and when she died, I'd taken them without really going through them. Medical records, insurance policies, old utility bills. Mostly things that needed to be shredded, but this folder was labeled, in her careful cursive, Dad, Business. Inside was 40 years of my father's record keeping. Purchase receipts, old lease agreements, letters from the municipality. And near the back, something I didn't expect, a stock certificate. 2 of them, actually, purchased in 1973 through a brokerage my father had used before I was old enough to know what a brokerage was. The company listed was a small resource extraction firm out of Calgary. I didn't recognize the name. The certificates were for 400 shares each, total 800 shares. The purchase price listed was $1.10 per share. I almost put them back. 51 years. Whatever company this had been, it had almost certainly been acquired, dissolved, or renamed 3 times over. The certificates were probably worth exactly what they were made of, paper. But something made me sit down on a plastic bin and look more carefully. The company name was partially familiar in the way that something old sits at the edge of your memory. I turned the certificate over. There was a transfer agent listed, a Toronto address. I took photographs on my phone and went home. My wife found me at the kitchen table that night with my laptop and a cup of cold tea I'd forgotten to drink. She looked at the screen, at the certificate photos, and said, "What is that?" I told her I didn't know yet. She put her hand on my shoulder and went to bed, and I kept looking. It took me most of the week and 3 phone calls to piece it together. The company had indeed been acquired, twice. First in 1988, then again in 2004. Each acquisition had involved share conversions. The transfer agent in Toronto, which still existed under a different name, had records of the account. Dormant, they called it. No one had ever submitted the certificates for conversion. What 800 shares had become, through 2 rounds of acquisition and 40 years of stock splits and conversions, was something I had to ask the agent specialist to walk me through twice, because the number he gave me the first time didn't register. 4,312 shares in a company that now traded on the TSX at a price that made me grip the edge of my kitchen table. I'm not going to tell you the number that night. Not yet. You need to understand that I sat with this information for 2 weeks before I told a single person. 2 weeks of going to sleep knowing something the rest of the world didn't know. 2 weeks of watching my wife rest her swollen hands in her lap and thinking about what this might mean. The reason I waited was not dramatic. It was practical. Philip and Terence had taken everything from me using a document I didn't understand. I was not going to make a single move without understanding exactly what I had. Not this time. I found a lawyer through a referral from a former client of mine. A woman who ran an engineering firm in North Bay and who had, years before, recommended me for a large industrial contract. She said there was a man in Ottawa who specialized in estate disputes and asset recovery. Someone who had spent 20 years as a commercial litigator before switching entirely to cases where people had been deprived of inheritance or family assets through fraudulent means. His name was not flashy. His office, when I went to see him, looked like a place where actual work got done rather than a place designed to make you feel you were paying enough. He listened to my full story without interrupting. When I finished, he asked me 4 questions, took notes, and said, "The document your brother had you sign has at least 2 clauses that I believe are challengeable on the grounds of material misrepresentation. The valuation used for the property buyout was, in my opinion, fraudulently low and may constitute constructive fraud under Ontario law. That's not a guarantee. But this is worth pursuing." Then I told him about the stock certificates. He looked at me for a moment. "And these were in your mother's estate?" "Yes." "Were they included in the estate inventory when she passed?" "No." I'd gone through her affairs quickly, I told him. I hadn't found that folder until now. He leaned back. "Then they were never legally part of the assets your brother had any claim to. They were overlooked estate assets, which means you, as surviving heir, and depending on the estate documents, potentially sole beneficiary of any undiscovered assets, have a legitimate and separate claim entirely." He paused. "How much are we talking about?" I slid the paper across his desk. He looked at it. He looked up at me. He looked back down. Thomas, he said, you need to open an estate account today, and we need to move on this carefully and quickly. Don't tell anyone. Not friends, not family. No one. The amount on that paper was $1,460,000. Give or take, depending on the day's close. I drove back to Sudbury in a March snowstorm, white-knuckling the wheel through Parry Sound, and I did not feel joy. Not yet. What I felt was something closer to the stillness that comes before a large decision. My father had bought those shares for $880 in 1973. He had filed them in a folder and forgotten about them. Or perhaps he'd always meant to look into them and never had the time. He died, never knowing what they'd grown into. And somehow, through an act of complete accident, I'd found them on the day I needed them most. My mother's estate documents, which my lawyer reviewed within the week, were clear. Any assets not enumerated in the original inventory remained the property of the estate, to be divided between surviving children. There was a complication. Philip was also a surviving child. This was not going to be simple. My lawyer advised patience and precision. We began the process of officially amending the estate to include the discovered assets. We notified the necessary parties. We filed the paperwork. Philip's lawyers contacted mine within 10 days of receiving notice. The tone of their letter was, my lawyer told me, with something approaching satisfaction, notably different from their previous correspondence. They were no longer dismissive. They were careful. What happened over the next 6 months, I will compress because the legal details are genuinely tedious. My lawyer challenged the 2020 partnership agreement on 2 grounds: the misrepresentation of its nature at the time of signing, and the fraudulent property valuation used to calculate my buyout. He engaged an independent appraiser who valued the Regent Street property at $1.4 million, nearly double what Philip's appraiser had submitted. He also filed a complaint against Terrence with the appropriate regulatory body. It turned out that Terrence had done something similar before, a case in Thunder Bay, a family business. An elderly man who'd signed documents he didn't understand. That complaint had been settled quietly. My lawyer made sure ours was not quiet. Philip retained 2 new lawyers. They negotiated. They delayed. They submitted counterfilings that my lawyer described as desperate. At one point, Philip called me directly, the first time he'd contacted me personally in nearly 2 years. His voice on the phone sounded different than I remembered. Smaller somehow. Tom, he said, can we talk about this like brothers? I let the silence sit for a long moment. We should have talked like brothers in 2020, I said. Before you handed me 43 pages drafted by a man who doesn't know our father's name. I hung up. My lawyer filed for summary judgment on the estate claim in the autumn of 2024. The shares were liquidated into the estate account, following a court order establishing my status as sole beneficiary of the undiscovered assets, a ruling that hinged on a single clause in my mother's will that Philip's legal team had apparently failed to read carefully enough. Of the $1.4 million, my portion, after legal fees and estate costs, was just over $900,000. I sat in my lawyer's office in Ottawa when he told me the final number. The same kind of stillness as before, but warmer this time. The business, the shop on Regent Street, was addressed separately. The court found that the 2020 agreement contained a materially misleading description of what I was signing, and that the valuation used was demonstrably fraudulent. The agreement was not fully voided. The courts rarely do that cleanly, but the terms were restructured significantly. Philip was ordered to pay me $640,000, representing the difference between the fraudulent valuation and the appraised value, plus damages. Terrence lost his registration. The regulatory body's decision came in the spring of 2025 and was about as favorable as those decisions get. You will not be advising anyone on family financial restructuring again. As for Philip, I don't know what to tell you about Philip. He is my brother. He's the person I carried on my shoulders at the Wolves games. He is also the person who sat at my kitchen table and handed me a document he knew I didn't understand, and watched me sign it, and said nothing. He sent a letter in the spring, handwritten, which surprised me. Not a long letter. He said he knew there was nothing he could write that would be sufficient. He said Terence had made it sound like a reasonable arrangement, that he'd convinced himself it was only accounting, that I'd still be running the shop and nothing would really change. He said he was ashamed. He said he hoped, eventually, maybe not now, I might be willing to have a conversation. I read it twice. I folded it and put it in a drawer. I haven't responded. Not because I want to punish him, but because I'm not ready, and I've decided I'm not going to do anything before I'm ready ever again. My wife cried when I told her the full number. Not dramatically. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her morning coffee, and I sat down across from her and told her everything from the beginning. The folder, the certificates, the Ottawa lawyer, all of it. And when I finished, she put her cup down and looked out the window for a moment, and then she cried quietly. She reached across the table and took my hands and said, "Your dad knew. Somehow he knew." I don't know if that's true. I think my father was a man who saved things carefully and never got around to claiming all of them. But I like the idea of it. We didn't move back into a large house. We found a clean bungalow in the south end of the city. Good bones, needs work. The kind of place I know how to fix. I've started consulting, welding inspections, technical assessments for engineering firms, enough to stay useful and not enough to exhaust me. My wife's medication is now paid for without me looking at the credit card statement afterward. One of my former employees, a young woman who'd been with me for 6 years before I had to let everyone go, reached out when she heard I was back on my feet. She asked if I'd be willing to mentor her through her own Red Seal exam. I said yes immediately. We meet on Tuesday evenings. I think about my father often, about the fact that he bought those shares for $880 and filed them in a folder, and then spent the rest of his life getting up early and coming home smelling of the work he'd done. He didn't know what he'd left me. He left me something better on purpose. The shop, the discipline, the belief that things built carefully last. But the shares. The shares were an accident that became something else. They were a hand reaching forward through time, not knowing who would need it or when. Just trusting that careful things kept in the right places have a way of finding the people who need them. My brother has not heard back from me. Not yet. I'm not carrying anger. I've found that anger is weight I can't afford at 65. But forgiveness is something I'm going to need more time for, and I'm not willing to offer it before it's real. When and if that day comes, it will mean something, or it won't come, and that will mean something too. What I know is this. I spent 1.5 years convinced my story was over, that everything my father meant for me to have had slipped through a clause I didn't read carefully enough. I sat in a cold storage unit in March, looking for my wife's grandmother's china, and I found something my father had forgotten, and it turned out to be exactly what I needed. Some people will call that luck. Maybe it is, but I've come to think that careful people leave careful things behind, and sometimes those things wait decades for the right person to go looking. I'm still looking. Every day. If this story reached you, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Leave it in the comments, and if it meant something to you, consider sharing it. There are people who need to hear that the arithmetic of continuing is always worth doing, even when it doesn't feel that way. Take care of yourselves out there. I mean that. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened. Not just the legal part. Anyone can follow a court ruling, but the part underneath it. The part where your own brother hands you a pen and watches you sign your life away and says nothing. What I keep coming back to is this. Philip didn't fail me in a moment of weakness. He planned it, carefully, over years, with Terence walking him through each step. And the thing about that kind of deliberate betrayal is that it doesn't just take what's yours. It takes your ability to trust your own judgment. For a long time after I signed those documents, I kept returning to that kitchen table in my mind, trying to find the moment I should have seen it coming, trying to locate my own failure. That's what betrayal does. It turns you into an auditor of your own past. But here's what I've learned, slowly, the hard way. The fact that I trusted Philip was not my weakness. It was his opportunity. Those are different things. A man who uses your decency against you has not exposed a flaw in your character. He's exposed something in his own that no amount of legal fees or regulatory action will ever fully correct. Terrence lost his registration. Philip paid what the court ordered, but neither of them can give back the years I spent in that two-bedroom apartment on the East End, lying awake doing the arithmetic of what I'd lost. That time is gone, and I've had to make a deliberate choice, not a comfortable one, not a quick one, to stop letting the weight of what they did occupy space that belongs to what comes next. My father never knew what those certificates would become. He bought them for $80 in 1973, filed them in a folder my mother labeled in her careful cursive, and went back to his life. He built a deck. He built a shed. He got up early every day and did what needed doing. That's the inheritance that actually kept me alive during the hard part, not the money, but the example. The understanding that you put your head down, you do careful work, and you trust that careful things accumulate. I think about the young woman I'm now mentoring through her Red Seal, a welder who reminds me of myself 35 years ago, sharp and serious, and not yet sure what she's capable of. I think about what I want to give her. Not money, not connections. The thing my father gave me without ever naming it. The belief that what you build with integrity is not so easily taken. That there are always things the people who betray you cannot reach, because they don't know those things exist. The interior things. The things you've quietly accumulated in the life lived with your eyes open and your hands honest. What Philip and Terrence did had consequences, not because the universe keeps score in any tidy way, but because actions have weight. Greed built on a lie requires constant maintenance. You have to keep the story straight. You have to manage the people who know. That is an exhausting way to live. And eventually the structure develops cracks. I didn't have to force that. I just had to stay standing long enough. Stay standing. Do the careful work. Keep the folder. That's everything I know.